Thank you for joining us today for the Dynamic Partner Connections webinar, Microsoft Dynamics SL 2015 Web Apps Customizing, which is part of our SL 2015 Readiness Launch and TPCE Encore webinar series. My name is Jenna Knobloch. I'm the Program Coordinator for Dynamic Partner Connections, and we're thankful to have Mark Asmus with us with Plumline Solutions to be our presenter today and talk to us about Web Apps Customizing. Mark, thanks for joining us, and before we get started, I'm going to give a quick introduction and update about Dynamic Partner Connections, DPC. So DPC's mission is to improve your Dynamics partner businesses. Our goal is to create this community and provide resources to help you be successful. To best prepare partners for success, these educational webinars are brought to you free of charge. Our mantra at DPC is to have partners help partners by sharing information, ideas, and experiences to better your businesses. And with the launch of SL 2015, we wanted to bring this Web Apps Customizing session to you. As I mentioned, this is part of our SL 2015 webinar series, and we're glad to have Mark here to deliver the content today. I also want to mention that Jeff soon will be hosting a webinar on project features on February 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to go and update that to our calendar out on the website. I'll show you right here. This is a screenshot of our upcoming webinars and upcoming events tab. If you click on the competency tab over on the left-hand side, it will bring up all of our upcoming events, and you can filter. If you were to use these tags by the green arrow, you can filter all of the SL upcoming webinars, and be sure to look for those that are most pertinent to you. This way you can drill down on the events and webinars most relevant to you. So we do have some great webinars on SL 2015 being brought to you. I do also want to mention that we have under the competency tab over on the left webinar recordings, and those are filtered out by product session as well. And so if you were to go to the SL folder under our content library, as we like to call it, you will find all of the sessions delivered on SL 2015. So membership to DPC is at the company level, so we encourage you to head on out to the website and take a look at all of the webinar recordings that we have out there for you. We also have an event coming up March 15th prior to Convergence, Microsoft Convergence, in Atlanta from 1 o'clock to 5:30 p.m. This is an in-person event, and this is, I think, the 5th year that we're hosting this partner-only event. So it's a great opportunity. If you are attending Convergence, we encourage you to register for this half-day free event. You can see some of the topics listed over on the right, but we have all product tracks featured, and then also all roles featured as well. And so there's going to be great topics, and we encourage you to go and get registered. You do have to be a DPC member to attend, but the great news is membership to DPC is free. So as long as you go out to the website and register for a membership, you're able to register for pregame. We hope to see you there in Atlanta. I do have a few poll questions, so I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll here. We want you to be successful, as I mentioned, and so please let us know what topics are of interest to you so that we can focus our programming efforts on those topics. So go ahead and complete the poll in front of you if you'd like to help us focus our efforts in the coming year. All right, there we go. Thank you. With that, I'm going to just go over a housekeeping item here. We're going to have everyone on mute to cut down on background noise, but if you should have a question, feel free to raise your hand in the question panel, and I can unmute you for your question. Otherwise, if you'd like to type your question into the question panel, I'd be happy to read that aloud for you. Mark has offered to take questions throughout, but we will be having some time at the end to ask your question as well. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to type that in the panel as well, and we'll go ahead and get started here. Mark, I'm going to hand the presenter rights over to you. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to hearing about web apps customizing today.
Great, thank you. Let's get this fired up here. Okay, so yes, we will be talking about web apps customization. I'll focus primarily on SL 2015, but pretty much everything we talk about today will also apply to SL 2011 SP2. All right, so today we're going to cover a few things, starting with some of the simplest types of customizations you might make and slowly getting more and more complex. We'll start with some of the built-in quote-unquote customizations. And these are things like the Project Flex Time tab over in Time and Expense Setup. There's a number of different things you can choose to show or hide or show but disable them. There's a lot of different fields if you're using that Project Flex Time page that you can kind of control the look and feel of without actually needing to truly customize things. So certainly start out by looking over there if what you're looking at is Project Flex Time, because you might be able to avoid having to actually create customizations to begin with. Other things that are available while you're in web apps, there are a couple of little flags here. You can change some sort order, the number of periods to display, whether or not you want to allow the duplicate item. Now, that was a real common one to do in Business Portal. People are always looking to hide that duplicate link in Business Portal, and you had to actually customize the ASP page to do that. In web apps, it's a built-in option. You don't need to customize anything to hide that. Other things you can look at in the web.config file on both the web apps and web services sites, there's a few flags that you can set. Those are documented over in the web apps deployment and web apps usability guides. So check those out to kind of familiarize yourself with what options are in there and things like that. The big bullet point here, though, is especially for those going to Convergence, keep an eye out for this. In the next release of web apps, there's going to be a lot more built-in options for customizing. Hiding options, disabling options, lots of good stuff. Similar to, again, for the Business Portal folks out there, that Project Portal setup page, if you're familiar with that, it's built along the same sort of lines. So really the hope is, well, if we can address 20, 30, 50%, maybe even 80% of most customers' needs using this built-in options, that sure would save a lot of work on your end from having to customize web apps. So check that out. You'll see more information about that starting around Convergence time. But I suspect those in attendance here weren't here to hear about the easy built-in stuff. You're here about the more complicated actual customizing. So before you get started in that, it's good to have kind of a feel for how web apps functions and what pieces are responsible for what. So this graphic attempts to help understand that. Hopefully it comes through okay on your browser. Otherwise, again, this is being recorded. You can also get the PDF downloaded after the fact of these slides. But the idea here is to get an understanding of where all of these pieces sit so that you know where to start when you want to change something. If you want to just change the look and the feel of a web app, that's all done in the view or the layout. So that's done at the web app layer, and that's where most of our discussion will focus on. If you actually want to change business logic or data validation or add custom tables or things like that, a lot of that work is done at the web services level. And when you start getting into that, you're looking at extending web services and customizing web apps. And so those are two different concepts to be thinking about. But again, this gives a nice little overview of what pieces talk to what and where you might need to go to be building out your customization. So again, we'll start with something simple, and that is just making simple little cosmetic changes. And for this, we provide the source code for web apps, but for some of these things you don't even really need the source code. You can actually directly edit the VB.html files that get deployed with web apps without really even needing Visual Studio or the source code or anything at all. So for example, maybe you just want to hide a field, or maybe change a label or something, or change the color of something. That's all pretty much straightforward HTML code. And you can edit the VB.html file to do that. I show an example here of hiding the advance amount field over an expense entry. If you don't use advances, why have the field there taking up real estate? Especially, screen real estate is at a premium when you start thinking about running this on a phone or running this on a tablet, so there's no reason to have fields on there if you never intend to use them. And hiding a field like that is real simple. The hardest part is probably figuring out which file to edit. So the tip on that is browse out to the page that you intend to edit. So here I am on the expense entry page in Web Apps, and again, I want to hide that advanced amount field. To know which file I'm going to edit, I'm going to take a look at my URL for some clues. So at the top here, my server is called SL2015 Web Apps, and then I'm in a folder called Project Expense and on a page called Expense Header. And I can see that all in my URL at the top. Now that translates back in my directory structure. So if I'm looking at my C drive on my Web Apps server, I deployed Web Apps to a folder called C:/SL Web Apps. All of these pages are in a subfolder called Views, and then from there this is where that URL comes in. So I was in a folder called Project Expense, so I'm going to go into the Project Expense subfolder, and then I'm going to look for the file called Expense Header. And there is one, expenseheader.vbhtml. So there's a real good chance that's the file I want to edit, and that's where I'm going to want to start. And it can be as simple as something as simple as opening that file in Notepad and making my change, which is exactly what you can do. So I can open that expenseheader.vbhtml file in Notepad, and I can start looking for advanced used. For the folks out there used to customizing Business Portal and editing ASP pages, you can probably use a lot of the same strategies that you've used for customizing Business Portal for doing edits like this. You might not really have a full understanding of the Web Apps code or how it all works, but if you can get this far, you can open the expense header VBHTML file, you can look at it in Notepad. I know I want to edit something called advanced, so just start looking for the word advanced. And down here near the bottom, I see there's a blob of code here. The TR tag is a row. I can see HTML label for advanced amount. There's an input tag for advanced used. So I'm pretty confident I'm on the right track. And if you're doing this in a test environment, this is a place to start trying things out. So if I just want to get rid of this, I can add a style tag here to hide it. So that's exactly what I added. What's highlighted yellow there, I added style equal visibility hidden, display none. And after I do that, I can reload my web app page, and I can see that it does in fact disappear. So on the left is what it looks like standard. I can see my advanced use field. And then on the right is what it looks like after my edit. So this is, if you haven't tried out modifying web apps, if you're not that familiar with it, this is a great little test that you can do on your own, pretty easy, without too much. You really don't need any prereqs to install because you can do it all in Notepad. It's a great way to get started. But if your needs go beyond just hiding a field or doing something simple like that, the next step up is actually looking at getting the source code. And you can download the source code from Partner Source. So both the 2015 source code and the 2011 CU1 source code is out there available for download. You get the complete Visual Studio solution. And of course those URLs are super long. But if you go out to Partner Source and just search SL 2015 Web App source code, it should come up. Otherwise, again, you can get this URL off the PDF after the fact. Something that we started doing recently was there's this question about what to do about hotfixes. If a bug gets identified in web apps and we fix it, which is great, what's that do to your customizations and what's that do to your source code? So as we fix things in web apps, we will be re-releasing the source code that corresponds with that. So here's a little snippet from what the download page looks like today, where again, if you look at the left here, there's a link for the web app's original release, RTM release, and then there's a download where you can actually download the source that includes hotfix 34508, and then there's another link where it includes hotfix 34770. That way, if a customer has a particular hotfix installed, you can come out to the same source code download page and get the corresponding copy of source code that goes with that. And this way we'll keep that whole history of all the different iterations to help kind of keep track of things. The other nice thing about this is if you wanted to see what changed, you could download both of them, both the original source and the hotfix source, and do a comparison between the two using Beyond Compare or whatever your favorite file comparison tool is, and you can actually see kind of what changed to do to fix the various bugs or whatever feature was enhanced. And yes, just said that. All right, onward. So if you go out there and you download it, you get this zip file, and that's great. Some of the technologies used, we're using Visual Studio 2012 or 2013 with .NET 4.5. MVC4 with Razor using VB.NET. We consume the web services for all the business logic. We're using jQuery, JScript, JavaScript, all good stuff. So if you're just getting started with this whole web apps thing, again, these are some technologies you may want to, if you're not familiar with this stuff, might be a good idea to, snag a book, a reference book, or find some online webinars, or find any other sort of training material you can find on these topics. They might not necessarily need to be geared towards Dynamics SL. They could just be generic training on jQuery or jQuery Mobile, and that can really help you along when you're customizing web apps. So again, you need Visual Studio 2012 or 2013 to open the solution. You'll want the Microsoft Web Developer Tools optional feature installed. You're also going to want Web Deploy installed, which some of these prerequisites, if you already have web apps installed on your development machine, which I would recommend, you're already going to have a lot of these prereqs done for you. Same with this next page. Again, SharePoint Foundation, Client Object Model, Report Viewer, OpenXML. Again, a lot of this stuff gets installed automatically if you just install web apps out of the box on your same development machine, which makes it a lot easier. Once you get all those prerequisites installed and you get the solution downloaded, unzipped, and opened in Visual Studio, if you start taking a look around, you'll see that that solution is made up of a number of different projects. One of the main ones you'll want to take a look at is the Microsoft.Dynamics.SL.Timecard.Mobile project. It is a mouthful. We like long names, I guess. This is kind of like the system level project. It's really kind of the core project that you want to look at. It deals with things like the menu, and some of the other common reuse things you'll want to take a look at in there. And this is actually, later on in a demo, we'll actually show modifying that particular project to modify the menu. You also see some models. Common model, again, is kind of the system level model. It kind of acts as that interface between your project and web services. And then you'll have all these individual sort of page-specific models for the communicator page, for the delegation page, expense entry, time card entry, quick query, all of those specific sort of pages. Think of those as like your screens in SL Rich Client. These are for all the different pages, and again, these are acting as that interface between web service and web apps. These become pretty important if you're going to start talking about adding new fields to the screen or adding a custom table to the screen. You're going to need to start modifying these. And then again, to go with the models, there's also multiple projects that feed into that. There's a separate project for most of the different pages: communicator, delegation, time card entry, etc. These projects, among other things, is what contains the VB.HTML files for the actual display and look and feel. So that's a good place to start looking as well for what to modify. In our earlier example where I just directly modified the VB.HTML file to hide a field, you could do the same thing by opening the solution in Visual Studio and modifying the expense entry project as well. And then you could package up a whole deployment that includes your modification. Here's a little screenshot on the right of what it's going to look like once we get in there. It's more for your reference later, but we'll see it live here in a little bit. So once you get that far, you've got the thing open, you've kind of feeling your way around. If you actually want to do something with it, you're going to need to build the solution. You probably want to build the resource file. If you're not familiar with this, the resource file is, instead of hard coding labels all over the place, all of these labels are stored back in a resource file that's all self-contained in a single DLL file. That way, instead of hard coding the word project or hard coding the word employee, we look up the label for project in the resource file. That way you can sort of system-wide rename a project to be a job. And instead of calling it an employee, you can call it a resource. And you can make system-wide label changes using that resource DLL. That's also how we intend on translating this. So if the whole thing needed to be translated into Spanish, theoretically you could just edit that one DLL file and deploy the one file, and poof, the whole thing's translated into Spanish. So it's pretty neat. So yeah, product build, resource build. Once the project's built, then you need to pick and choose and move the files you need to a pre-deployment area and sort of arrange them in a format that Web Apps Deployment likes. Once that's all staged, then you actually build the deployment, which is essentially just zipping up that staging area and prepping it for the deployment tool. Sounds like a lot of work, but we do have some scripts to help automate that whole process, which we will show. And here's a little, again, build source, then moves the files to the staging area, and then actually make the deployment, which is really just zipping up the files from the staging area. So again, it sounds like a lot of work, and it is, if it's be almost impossible without the help of these files. When you download the source code, just the source, on the left, in the bottom left picture there, you'll see that it includes a couple of text files. You're going to want to open these and look through them. For me, I needed to read them 2, 3, 4 times before I really kind of understood what they were getting at. But definitely spend a little bit of time reading those 4 text files, the building.txt, customizingwebapps.txt, overview.txt, and resources.txt. Those are going to be your friends. You're going to want to read those a couple times to fully understand that. Those text files are what tells you what files need to go where and helps attempt to help you get that thing packaged up correctly. Taking things a step further, out on the source code download page, there's also a sample app that you can download, which is what we're kind of going to be looking at. It includes some sample customizations that are already done for you. It also includes some batch files which automate the process of moving things to the source. So on the screenshot on the right, you'll see there's 4 batch files: a make deployment, place and deploy, resource build, and then a strong key match file. That already has it all packaged up to where it's going to move the files where they need to be and hopefully make your life a little bit easier. And I'll demo using, that's what I'm going to use in the demo later, is using those batch files. Another brief mention about the resource file. I talked about this a little earlier. Here's a little sample screenshot of what that looks. Essentially on the left is the name of the tag, so project, or project address, or project amount. And on the right is the actual label as it's going to show in Web Apps. So if I wanted to rename project to job, I could theoretically just do that in the resource DLL, redeploy the one file, and should be good to go. In the documentation, it talks about how building the resource DLL is optional, and it is, but there's almost no downside to just building it all the time anyway, which is what I would do. So just, even if you don't plan on changing it, just build it anyway. That way you end up with a complete deployment and avoid possible errors. Here's a screenshot of what I'm talking about. In the Web Apps directory, in the bin folder, in ENUS, it's this Microsoft.dynamics.sl.mobile.resources.dll. That's the file we care about. The big advantage of building it anyway is, again, your deployment's going to contain everything, including that DLL, so you reduce the risk of it going missing. If you are missing that DLL file, you get an error like this. So if you're playing around with building and deploying web apps and customizing web apps and you get an error that looks like this, it's because you're missing that DLL file. you're missing that resource DLL file. You can, to get around it, if you didn't plan on changing anything in there, you can just snag a copy from any working web apps deployment, just a standard one. Just drag and drop that file back where it goes, and you're fine. You don't need to redeploy or anything fancy like that. But really, again, I just recommend building the thing. Cool. So let's actually demo this so you can kind of see what it looks like. So here I am in a folder called Test Folder on my C drive. I have downloaded both the source code and the sample app that's out there. I'd really recommend downloading that sample app and playing with that. That's what I've done. So you can see I've got my batch files here, which are awesome, and I've got my source code. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the source code. So I'm going to go out here into my source folder. Here's all my source, and here's the Visual Studio Solution file. So I'm going to go ahead and open that solution. Now when you're first starting out, before you touch anything, before you do anything, I'd probably recommend just proving to yourself that you can actually build this thing without errors. This is going to verify you got the prerequisites installed, you've got all the files where they need to be, and again, why bother touching anything until you can at least prove you can build the out-of-the-box solution. And mine built correctly, so build succeeded, so I know I have a functioning solution here. Once you've got it built once, and I guess next up is trying to find something you want to try modifying. I'd probably try and familiarize yourself with where things are at in here. So along the right, you'll see a lot of different stuff. You'll see these models that we talked about earlier, the project expense model, invoice, project, quick query. And then you also see those different projects, the time card entry, expense entry, project approval, things like that. Again, I mentioned earlier that if you wanted to do that simple example of hiding the advanced amount field, if you wanted to do that in source, you can. It's in project expense, so I'll expand the project expense project. All of our HTML files are under a folder called views, so I'll expand the views folder. And then I'm just going to look for that expense detail file again, and I can find the same thing in here, make the same change, compile, redeploy, and move along. So this method is, for a small change like that, this is going to be a whole lot more work. But oftentimes I suspect you're going to be doing more than just one little change. You might have a whole series of changes across the board, and so at some point it might end up making more sense to do all of the changes within Visual Studio, package it all together, and now you have something much easier to deploy to multiple customers. But for this, since you've already seen that, let's show something a little bit different. One change we've had a couple people ask about is modifying the menu. The menu, again, is sort of a system-level concept, so I'm going to look under this system-level project, which is my Dynamics SL Timecard Mobile project. And again, I'm going to start under Views, because that's where all our interface look and feel is. And lucky enough, I see a menu.vb HTML file, so I'm going to start there. Again, without knowing anything else, it seems logical to start at menu if I want to modify the menu. Once I got that open, I can see there's this whole big collection of code and what looks like HTML code as well. So you can kind of scroll along and get a feel for what these pages look like. And after staring at it long enough, it starts to make a little bit more sense. But for the purpose of a demo, maybe I want to hide the project analyst link. You know, when you first log in, I don't know if I'm logged in over here, as my web app spins up here. Let it idle too long. So this project analyst link, maybe I want to get rid of that. Maybe I don't plan on using it, and I just don't want it to be on my menu cluttering things up. I don't want my users accidentally clicking on it and not be able to do anything with it. So I just want it out of there. Well, again, I'm back in Visual Studio. I'm looking at my menu VBHTML file, and I'm going to start looking for something called Project Analyst. And after staring for long enough, I can find this action link. It talks about Project Analyst. And so I'm pretty sure this is the line that I've highlighted blue here that's adding that link to the menu. So if I want to get rid of it, one option is I could just delete all this stuff, which would do the trick probably, but then if I forget to save that somewhere else, I've just lost my code, and what if it didn't work or something like that. So an easier option is maybe to either comment it out, or I can see this is included in an if block. So I'm just going to add something like and true equals false. Since true never equals false, it's never going to go into this if statement. So it's always going to say if true equals false. Well, no, it doesn't, so then it's going to move on and skip this. So theoretically, it won't add Project Analyst to my menu, and so I've effectively removed it without actually having to delete any code here. So again, I'll save all, and I will rebuild. Again, for those out there, I really recommend just starting something small and simple like this. Something where you're going to notice whether it worked or not right away, but not something so big that you're going to have to spend a whole bunch of time debugging to know whether are you building this correctly, are you deploying it correctly, or do you actually have a coding error. So do something nice and simple like this where it's pretty confident this isn't going to cause a coding error, so I'm not going to have to troubleshoot that angle. So I built it, but from our slides earlier, I know that's only one piece of the puzzle. I still have several other steps left. Once I've built it, all that does is update the files out here with my coding changes. The next step is I need to move all that stuff to a deployment area or a staging area. And again, you can do that manually, but it would take you forever. So the much better way of doing it is using these batch files. And I'll just take a quick look at these. So these batch files use robocopy commands to copy all the files that you need and put them in the correct directory. And it does all this for you. Now, if you were to read all those text files that come with the source code, it would tell you kind of what to do here, but with these batch files, it's already kind of done for you. So it's going to save you a lot of work. So it's grabbing the various JavaScript files, the various DLLs, the various views, all this stuff for you. I don't even know half the stuff it's doing, and I don't need to know what it's doing because I know this works, this is what's needed, so I can roll with it. The resource build, I talked about that earlier. There's just a couple commands here to build that resource DLL. I'm going to go ahead and build it even though I didn't make any changes to it. And then the make deployment. Once everything's moved to the staging area, then you need to make the deployment file, which is really just the zip file. It essentially just zips everything up and preps it for the deployment packager, which we'll see later. So I could run these 3 batch files manually, or I could run this batch file, place and deploy, which just calls the other ones for me. So instead of 1 batch file, I just run, instead of 3 batch files, I run 1. So let's do that. I have a developer command prompt open here, something with admin privileges so you don't run into access rights issues. And it rolls through a whole bunch of stuff. Again, I don't even know half the stuff it did, but it doesn't matter because I know it's going to do what it needs to do, which is, I was in source, so now I jumped in here, sorry. So the first phase was to take the source files it needs, creates the staging area, which is my WA folder. This will probably look a little bit more familiar to people who've played around with web apps. Once it's created that staging folder, it's essentially going to zip it up into my deployment file, which is this zip file, which the deployment console can use. So if I were to ship my customization off to a customer, I really just need these 4 files that are highlighted here. I can zip those up, and now any customer can deploy my change, which I can do now. This deployment tool is essentially the same thing we use to ship and deploy the standard web apps product. So it's a very common looking interface here, something you're going to be used to. This error here, I'm glad this appeared. This you can ignore. Access to the path resource DLL is denied. If you don't like getting error messages and you want to avoid this, just do an IIS reset before you redeploy. Because my website was up and running and I was recently logged in, IIS was using this DLL file, and so the deployment thinks it was in use. It really wasn't. You can ignore it. It's going to copy it over anyway. But again, if you don't like getting errors, just do an IIS reset first. And since I'm overwriting an existing site, my deployment's real easy. I just click Next a bunch of times, and then I can do a verify. And while it spins up the web services here, it should come back clean, and it did. So if I refresh my web app site, and I log back in, there's going to be a bit of a delay on login because after redeploying, it's going to essentially stop and restart my site, which means now my web apps web service has got to spin up again. So you do get an initial delay here as those websites spin up in IIS. Probably a good time to mention that I am running web apps and web services and SQL and Visual Studio all on the same machine. Obviously, you'd never want to do that in a production environment, but for a development environment, it works really great, and we'll see another advantage to that here in a minute. But now that I'm logged in, I can see my project analyst link is no longer there. So it's nothing terribly fancy. It's nothing earth-shattering. I'm not even sure how many people are really going to want this particular customization, but it's a nice thing to start with to be able to go through that whole compile and deploy process so you can prove to yourself that it's working, it does function, I can deploy this, and then from there spend your time focusing on actual coding and actual HTML5 and JavaScript and all that good stuff coding instead of worrying about the whole deployment concept and this whole project solution. So once that's cooking, a lot of times the next question that kind of comes up is what if I needed to debug something? If I wanted to debug something for the Dynamics SL SDK VB Tools folks out there, we're used to being able to hit the little play button here or debug, start debugging option, the F5. You know, we liked that feature over in VB Tools, but you're not going to be able to do that in web apps. If I click Start Debugging here, it's going to crash and burn. It's not going to function. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. Instead, what you can do, again, don't click Start Debugging. Instead, under Tools, do Attach to Process. So we're going to attach to process, and we're going to look for our IIS process, our actual website, which is W3WP. Now I have two of them here. One of them is for my web app site. One of them is for my web services site. I don't know which one is which. Doesn't really matter. Attach to both of them, and you'll be fine. If you don't see W3WP listed, make sure to have Show Processes from All Users checked, and then it should show up. That's assuming you're running web apps on the same machine. Web apps does function on Windows 8, so if you're developing on a Windows 8 machine, you can deploy it on a Windows 8 machine. I suspect you can get this to work on a remote machine, but it's going to be a bit more work and kind of goes beyond what I'm going to cover here. But I'm going to attach this, so I'll click the button. Visual Studio is going to do its thing here, kind of spin around. Prompt me for security because my website is running as a different user. That's fine. I do want to attach. And I get my little ready message down here in Visual Studio. So it thinks I'm ready. I'm also going to set a breakpoint. I've sent one right here on this if statement that I modified. And so now I want to see if I can get into this breakpoint. So I'm going to go back to Internet Explorer. I'm going to log out. And this is just regular out-of-the-box Internet Explorer. It's nothing fancy there. I'm going to log back in. and poof, I didn't click anything. It jumped me right back into Visual Studio, right to the line that I breakpointed. So again, even though you can't do debug, start debugging, you can attach the process and debug that way. Works great. Actually, once you get used to it, it probably works better than the other option. So from here, I can do all my normal debugging options. I can step into, step over, step line by line through this, or I can just say, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is going to work, and I can just continue on. And poof, it takes me back to Internet Explorer and finishes out doing what it was doing. So it works pretty good. And really, you know, I've been asked this by a couple people. There really isn't any voodoo magic going on here. It should really work just how you saw it here, where you deploy your code, you load it in Internet Explorer, you attach the W3 WP process, you set your breakpoint, and they should just communicate and work together pretty well. So it's pretty slick. Other debugging option while we're in here that you might want to get used to is if you hit F12, Internet Explorer, and actually a lot of the different browsers, Chrome and Firefox have this as well, have a development console built into them. And this can be handy to debug things like JavaScript errors. It can also be handy to see kind of what gets rendered to the clients. I've used this before to track down access denied errors. You know, if you get a generic 401.11 or something access denied error, regular Internet Explorer doesn't give you a whole lot of clues as to what you don't have access to. But sometimes this F12 function can actually pinpoint it to a particular, you know, maybe it can pinpoint it to this particular JavaScript file, or it can pinpoint it to a particular style sheet file and actually help narrow down your search on what do you mean I don't have access? I'm an admin, I should have access. It can help narrow down what user is being used and what file it's having a problem with. So F12, and this isn't just a web apps thing, you can use this, you can browse to any website and hit F12 and kind of see what's going on. So it's kind of a handy little thing. If you've never used it before, try it out and see how it can help you. Cool. All right. So again, just to wrap up before we head back to the PowerPoint, I want to go back to this test folder and again just illustrate. If you download just the regular source code zip, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get the deployment files that you need, which are these files that you need to ship to the customer. It's the deployment console. And you're going to get the source. And included in the source are these text files that kind of help explain what to do. If you download the sample app that's out there, what you get is all of this other stuff, which includes these batch files, which are going to make things a little bit easier. You're also going to get a copy of the PowerPoint, very similar to the one I'm using now, but a copy of the PowerPoint that was done back in October at Partner Connections, which again explains some of the other customizations that were done in this. You know, for a 1-hour webinar, we don't have time to get into anything too real deep, but this sample does have an example of actually adding your own custom table and extending the web service to feed that into web apps, and it goes through a lot more advanced topics than what we would have time to cover in a webinar format. So it's a good thing to check out once you get comfortable with actually building the solution, deploying something simple, and you're kind of over that hurdle. The next step would probably be to explore this. It's adding custom lookups, it's adding a custom table, it's extending the web service, and it's doing all that good stuff. So certainly something worth checking out. Okay, a lovely demo. And I know I went through some of that pretty quick. Happily, this is being recorded, so you can always play it back after the fact and pause and rewind and all that good stuff. And again, here's a screenshot of what that download page looks like. The sample app that I'm referring to, the download is called MSDSL Web App 2015 Custom. That's the file you want to go looking for. So again, I just demoed some pretty simple stuff to get started, but other possible things you can change, things like maybe you want to change something to default a particular task or project or sub-account. maybe you want to add some custom links here and there, maybe you want to add whole new pages. You can do all that with the source. If you want to go beyond, I hinted at this earlier, if you want to start feeding in custom tables and custom fields, that's where you're going to have to start talking about extending the web service. We provide the web app source, but we don't provide the web service source because that's the intellectual property, that's the business logic that's locked down. But you do have an opportunity to extend it, similar to like Customization Manager, where you're modifying a executable of one of the rich client screens. You can do the same sort of concept with web service. You get an opportunity to modify things before web service and after web service. And that's where you'd add in your custom tables. And again, here's kind of a little graphical representation of that, where the standard project DLL web service can then talk to your custom web service and fire events before or after the standard stuff, and then that would interact with the database for you. Another thing that's come up before we've been asked about is adding links to other SRS reports. For those familiar, all the project analyst stuff is all SRS reports. And so if you maybe have your own set of SRS reports that are really handy and you want to add a link and do something similar to how we did Project Analyst, this is an example of a link you can use to link into that. Just feed back into the Project Analyst. You can control access rights just like we do using a screen number parameter and fun stuff like that. Cool. Boy, time flies. So questions. Now's the time. If you've got any, go ahead and ask them or punch them in. As you think of your questions, there are a few extra little slides here near the end that I can roll through, and again that are going to be included in your downloaded PDF. One is a little more discussion about this resource file. If you end up having problems compiling that, or if you run into errors, this is documented in the resource.txt file, but you might need to modify a line in there. Here's another nice little graphic that talks more about extending that web service. It's sort of a zoom-in snippet of the graphic you saw earlier. Again, more stuff about extending web services, which is a topic unto itself, but that's all right. Maybe some other time down the road we can do a webinar on that. But the idea is similar idea to how we do Customization Manager, where you can have different levels. That way you can have multiple ISV solutions layered on top of each other and have them remain compatible. Again, a slide here, I'm not going to read it to you, but just so you know that it's in here. More information about that debugging thing that I showed you, how you can attach the W3WP process, how you don't want to use IIS Express, and other things like that. Again, a little mention about the F12 in Internet Explorer, and you can even step through JavaScript code using the F12 Explorer as well. Just a little snippet there. You can set the file version. If you're going to be making changes to these DLLs and you want to track your own file version, you can do that. If you want to do custom themes, here's a slide that talks more about doing custom themes. I'm just going to click through this real quick, but just know that this information is in here. Again, you can use Theme Roller and create your own custom themes to change the look and feel. Essentially, you go out here, you click Next, you do some stuff. It's all web-based. And it essentially creates a CSS file for you that you can download and use to customize the look and feel, just sort of the colors and how the buttons look within web apps. Cool. I think that takes us to the end of our slides.
Great, Mark. I do have a question for you.
Great.
Going back to SSRS, the question is there an easy way to change the location of the Project Analyst SSRS report for testing a new version where the client only has one instance of SSRS?
Sure. So the way web apps knows where it is, so I probably still have my customized version where I don't have that link anymore. Oh, and I still have my breakpoint, so I'm still attached. Imagine that. Oh, I should have changed it. All right, let's do that again. Sorry. Well, here you get a little extra demo of how nice stepping through code can be here. So I'm just going to take this out and continue. And didn't do that. All right, whatever. Okay. Anyway, sorry for the sidetrack there. So if the question is, can you modify where the SRS reports are for testing purposes if you only have one deployment? One option is go ahead and create just a second deployment on some other port. You can have multiple web app deployments sitting side by side. And if you're just going to be doing some testing, just don't tell anyone where the other one is. Assign it some random port number like 888 or 999 that you can use internally. That way you have two web app deployments side by side. But at the root, the way web apps knows where your report server is by a record in the system database, the SL system database, in the rs_report server table. So in that rs report server table, there's going to be a record, and that tells it where your report server is. So if you wanted to change this, you could just change these two URLs to a different SRS server, or maybe you're going to keep the same server and you're just going to put it in a different folder. You can change the folder, do your test, change it back, and you're good to go. This record is created when you do the SL SRS deployment tool. It creates this record, but this is the one and only place where web apps knows where report server is. Again, there's no registry entry, there's no web config entry or anything like that. So this is the one and only spot it knows. Cool. All right.
He says, perfect, thanks. Are there any other questions out there? Go ahead and feel free to type your questions into the question panel, and I'd be happy to read those aloud. Or if you do raise your hand, there's a little hand icon, and I can unmute you to ask your question. There's another question here, Mark. Where do we find the PowerPoint deck? Oh, I know that one, Delmer. Sorry, I was reading. I'm going to be posting that on our content library out on the DPC website, and there's going to be an SL folder in the content library, and I will be posting that later this afternoon, the slide deck and the webinar recording. So you can go back and rewatch or download the webinar recording and download the slide deck. All right, any other questions?
Well, great, thanks. Thanks for attending today, and hopefully it was a little helpful. I guess get out there and try some things out and see how they pan out for you.
Wonderful. Mark, do you have your contact information that folks can contact you if they have questions after the webinar?
Yeah, I don't know. Is it on the? Oh, Jeff, we signed you up to be the contact in the slide. That's fine. Yeah, you can ping Jeff or you can ping me. Mine's b-masmus@microsoft.com. Or if you email Jeff, he can either answer it or refer you.
Mark, you're in trouble for doing that. You know that, right?
I think you put it in there.
Send your email address.
All right. Well, Mark, we thank you so much for your time. We have quite a few lots of good information. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your help. Extremely helpful. So it appears that you met the needs of everyone on the call today. So thank you for your time, and thank you everyone who attended the webinar. We hope to see you on a webinar again soon. Have a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.